Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr. Tonight's guest, noted author Paul Goodman.
Mr. Paul Goodman is, roughly speaking, everything, except, as far as I know, a basketball player. Everything else he excels in. I suppose I should list Mr. Goodman's eccentricities. He is a pacifist, a bisexualist, a poverty cultist, an anarchist, and a few other distracting things.
I'm not a poverty cultist.
Oh, God said to Abraham, kill me a son. Abe said, man, you must be putting me on.
Would they deny that there's been every kind of effort to create an insane consensus? And when you students try to do something about it, in order to save my kid from being fried, whether what you're doing is right or wrong, it's something.
You know, while other people were looking at Tab Hunter or Rock Hudson or whoever they were, we were looking at Goodman and Allen Ginsberg. They were the people who were our stars.
Why are you so hostile?
Because I want to watch the Knicks on television.
Is that Paul Goodman?
He was quick, he was lucid, he was hawk-faced. He was tweedy, rumpled, craggy.
He had this great twinkle in his eye.
I don't think he had the most loving personality in the world.
He could write something so you'd say, hey, we could do that. He was the philosopher of the New Left.
He was an ornery person. He was a difficult person. Also a very generous and open and wonderful person.
He was a political radical, a Jew. He was gay or bisexual, and very openly so in 1947.
His insistence on actually being who he was inconvenient in every company.
It must have been very hard for him. To want to live truthfully meant that he could hardly live with anybody.
He really suggested another way of being.
Paul Goodman changed my life.
We've got here in the studio 4 men who will react, I imagine, in very different ways. We have Paul Goodman, a philosopher and an anarchist. We've got Stokely Carmichael. We have Allen Ginsberg, a poet.
Allen and I are good friends, but I'm afraid that, see, Allen is white, so that he doesn't have to go through the persecution I go through all the time in the United States.
Oh, look, I mean...
Don't defend the United States anymore.
Stop defending the United States. Look, Allen and I'm not defending the United States. Look, Allen and I are queer, for instance, I take it. And I don't know about Allen, but I don't know. And I assure you, we go through plenty of indignities in our life.
Oh, man, come on. You go through indignities over...
Of course, he had his corncob pipe, his beat-up sweater, tousled hair, his baggy corduroy pants, a sideways grin, and that was one of his characteristic expressions, slight bemusement at us children.
I can still see him very vividly. That loping walk of his, going up 8th Street, talking away a mile a minute even when he was all by himself.
When Paul Goodman wrote Growing Up Absurd, he electrified the public.
The book Growing Up Absurd was a Bible of my generation of college students in the 60s. We felt so spoken to. We felt, here's somebody that gets it, that gets us.
Juvenile delinquency, you know, had gotten invented so that, you know, when a headline said JD, everybody knew what it meant for the first time in 1959. And in fact, the reason that Paul wrote that book, Growing Up Absurd, was because a publisher came to him and said, why don't you write a book about juvenile delinquency? That's what the book was supposed to be about.
We see groups of boys and young men disaffected from the dominant society. The young men are angry and beat. The boys are juvenile delinquents. These groups are not small, and they will grow larger. Certainly, they are suffering. Demonstrably, they are not getting enough out of our wealth and civilization. It is hard to grow up in a society in which one's important problems are treated as non-existent. It is impossible to belong to it. It is hard to fight to change it. The effect must be rather to feel disaffected. In this book, I shall ask, is the harmonious organization to which the young are inadequately socialized perhaps against human nature, or not worthy of human nature, and therefore there is difficulty in growing up? If this is so, the disaffection of the youth is profound and will not be finally remedial by better techniques of socializing.
There was a whole generation that didn't know what to do with themselves.
See, we live in a society and where these kids have been subjected to a bad educational system at the college age for 14, 15, 16 years, in which they have never had a chance to find their own identity, certainly not their vocation. So far as they can see, most of the vocations in our society are corrupt. Very few are exempt from that. You know, the law is corrupt, business is corrupt, politics is corrupt, the physical sciences have become corrupt. Religion is becoming a little less corrupt for them.
Growing Up Absurd, when I was younger, was this iconic book. It was a book that you had to contend with. I was living in a small Texas town. If I stayed in Texas, it just wasn't going to work for me. I had to break away. Paul Goodman was someone who helped strengthen that resolve in me, or that ambition. So this relationship sort of, just to put it that way, developed a feeling that this was a sympathetic soul, someone who was speaking for me.
The subtitle describing your book, Growing Up Absurd, the similar plight of the juvenile criminal and the organization man, of the youthful dissenter and the youthful conformist, and how we waste our human resources in America today. It's a book on waste, really.
Yes, waste of humanity, yes. Waste of the most hopeful part of humanity, namely the growing up part. See, growing up, Dodge, is like in a tree. The whole tree is alive, but the most alive part is that cambium layer, the growing layer. And if you do not keep that part healthy, then very soon the whole tree begins to wither away.
It was young people that took up the book, devoured it. It was on I mean, you couldn't walk into a college dorm room in those days and not see that book on the shelf. It was everywhere. And it really marked us.
I had a hard time actually getting a copy to reread this book, and because it's not published now. But I did finally, and it was an interesting experience because it was in many ways very different than I remembered it. It's strikingly different in the fact that it's only about men. And he makes a big point of that I'm not talking about women. When I say young men and boys, he said a girl does not have to make something of herself. Her career does not have to be self-justifying. But if boys do not grow up to be men, where shall the women find men? Or the children find real fathers? Anyway, I thought, so why didn't that turn me off at the time? And why, the rest of the women here of my generation who remember reading this, I don't remember being offended by it. I grew up in a family in which being a mensch, which means manly, didn't mean manly, it meant being a mensch.
In exactly 1 minute, you will meet Paul Goodman, the American radical and essayist, author of such well-known books as Growing Up Absurd, and for more than a decade, the guru of the New Left. Paul Goodman, talking about the new youth with Pierre Burton in 1 minute.
I know what ails these young people. I think I understand what their justified grievance is. I think I know what in our society has caused it, and morally they're 100% in the right all along the line. I don't think they know what the score is and will ever find out by themselves. Never, never, never.
It was a 2-week Congress of Intellectuals.
Most professionals are finks. They don't begin to remember what it's like to be a real professional. An engineer who will say when they tell them, here, we've decided to build the road here and there, so that's a rotten place to build a road, it's bad for the communities, take your road and fuck yourself.
This activity of complaining gets semi-specialized. It falls on certain people take it on as an enterprise, as an activity. Sometimes a distinct group of people, like the prophets of ancient Israel, sometimes freelance individuals like Socrates and the satirists of ancient Rome, who are critical of the hierarchical arrangements, the institutional rigidities, the hypocrisies of their time, and whose complaints echo the complaints of ordinary people.
Paul was really the first person I knew who really stood for me as an example of moral courage. And it was so absolutely almost effortless on his part that for a long time I didn't even realize that that is what he was about. The very best example of that was causerie at the military industrial.
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest.
Here's Paul in the midst of Stop the Draft Week in October of 1967, Lord knows for what reason, invited to give a talk in a government building to arms suppliers, arms profiteers, research and development people and so on, and point after point called them on the carpet for what they were doing, all under the rubric of, it is precisely you people who are ruining this country.
You are the military industrial of the United States, the most dangerous body of men at present in the world, for you not only implement our disastrous policies, but are an overwhelming lobby for them. And you expand and rigidify the wrong use of brains, resources, and labor so that change becomes difficult.
But he withstood the jeers and the catcalls and all of that. That is the best public example I know.
These remarks have certainly been harsh and moralistic. We are none of us saints, and ordinarily I would be ashamed to use such a tone. But you are the manufacturers of napalm, fragmentation bombs, the planes that destroy rice. Your weapons have killed hundreds of thousands in Vietnam, and you will kill other hundreds of thousands in other Vietnams. I'm sure that most of you concede that much of what you do is ugly and harmful at home and abroad, but you would say it is necessary for the American way of life, at home and abroad, and therefore you cannot do otherwise. Since we believe, however, that that way of life is itself unnecessary, ugly, and un-American, I and those people outside, we cannot condone your present operations. They should be wiped off the slate.
I think he's a sort of figure that's hard to classify. And he was all over the place. People didn't know what to do with him, and he was a gadfly. He wrote poetry, fiction, plays, essays in subjects which academics like to keep for themselves and call the social sciences. He was a moralist. He wrote about the arts, he wrote about literature. He was a practicing lay psychiatrist. I think he made people uncomfortable. He was a professional outsider at the same time that he did end up having enormous influence. He was a kind of model for me. And although we have some early examples of people like that, Emerson, for instance, we haven't produced many of them in the 20th century, and Goodman is perhaps the most interesting.
Goodman's central theme is really a comic theme, but at the same time it's a tragic theme. That is, the circumstances into which we're born are so unnatural, are so dangerous in so many ways, and so much of that is built into the social circumstances in which we're born, that more than anything else we want out, but to be out is to go nuts. However, to be in is also to be challenged, to have your sanity challenged, and more likely than not, one way or another, you're going to go crazy too if you're in. So what do? Are you in or are you out? This is the chief problem that we all deal with one way or another.
The Empire City by Paul Goodman.
What I try to do in this novel is to take the idea of Don Quixote and turn it upside down. See, the Don was rather cracked, although very noble. moving around in a society where people were pretty commonsensical. What I do is the reverse. I say the society that any reasonable person lives in now is pretty cracked. What I try to do is bring together a group of characters who insist on being just sane as hammers, and calling every spade a spade, and acting according to their really considered desires. But they are sane and the society is mad. You see, therefore it's
Don Quixote in reverse.
Don Quixote in reverse. But the Don is alone, and that's very important for the picture, because a alone man is bound to be crazy.
A lone man is bound to be
crazy. You cannot live alone. You will be crazy.
Man is a social animal.
Yes.
Paul was very close to Susie from the time she was small. Susie lived with him. I think his first wife, Jenny, had not been that eager to have a child, and Paul was the one who wanted one. And he said, you know, he'd take care of it when they split up, and he did, in fact. Paul knew about bringing up a child through that.
Here's a poem for my daughter very ill with polio. My little darling looked so pale today, fading away, pining and thin like the transparent moon in the afternoon. I cannot sleep, obsessed by Susie's colorless, cheerless face and bony body in my arms too light. She who was bright, comparable to the meadow flowers. Alas, that the mowers passed and did not spare. Their petals droop, my shoulders stoop for fear, and neither can I breathe for fear. Nay, hear my prayer, nature, who alone healest, and not wishes, nor art, nor pity. And do thou, Creator Spirit, visit her with the quick future that alone stirs to courage, and to walk, and to work.
Was it hard for him to be the mother and the father, or was it hard for me? I don't know. Hard for him is a hard question. I mean, it's obviously what he wanted. He made that happen. There are other things he could have done. I think that was the way it was, with some grumbling. On the other hand, there wasn't a mommy figure to be there, and he really was there tremendously.
Dinner at Paul Goodman's. I enjoy Paul and company and their peculiar otherworldly beauty. The little boy, Matthew Reddy, is still awake and dirty and pagan. Back at the Goodmans, Paul reads us the end of Faustina, the best new play that I know. Matthew Reddy is asleep. The huge dog Tinkerbell is quiet, and the atmosphere calm.
With Matthew, it was like being himself born all over again. A new chance in life, you know, a boy who can be me and who can have a life that I didn't have.
Ready is the password before aim. The past is ready not to intervene if I stand out of the way. And in the garden, the animals stand ready to be named, ready like a drunken father with admirable precepts. I hereby name my son for that which I am not.
I went to Black Mountain College in the summer of 1950. I remember him very vividly. He came with Sally and 2 children. I believe I always referred to her as his wife, a common law wife. I found him enormously interesting. He was not a big, tall, or imposing figure as such, but he had a kind of enormous physical vitality and energy. He had a way of attracting and commanding attention. He was always talking, it was very interesting. He was very brilliant. He was extremely original. He was very disruptive. He would act out.
You know, I had a dream about him last night. There was a big blue ball, and it was hurled
into the air in both a playful and an annoying way, so that it just went, you know, zooming its own way, knocking things over, but it was joyous and it was kind of mischievous. That word was in the dream, and I realized that there was a good aspect to mischievousness, that it kept people perky, and that considering that I was now 79, I would have to be careful not to become too devoid of mischievousness. He was an exciting teacher. He was very suited to Black Mountain. He was a person that either enjoyed or unwittingly produced a lot of argument around him. That was very good for getting people to think more. He struck people as troubling. He had a very strong agenda about introducing discussions and questions, and also his own desires about relations to boys and men into places where people didn't find them welcome.
What was just quite astonishing to me was seeing him there with a family, and a family that he clearly cherished, because there was nothing devious about any of this. It was just in the open. It seemed to be not a theoretical proposal, but something put into practice. Towards the end of the summer, it came to a head, and I believe that Paul Goodman wanted to stay at Black Mountain and was rejected.
And of course, the gay question came up, but what also came up was urinating on the ball field, pissing on the ball field. That was part of his agenda, you know. Functions and all the parts of life were to be right out there for everybody to see, whether they wanted to or not.
And I loved the way his hands were. They were beautiful. His hands. But I remember looking at them, and he could peel, he did, you know, without thinking about it, peel oranges if he was going to eat one, so that the peel came out in one piece. And I found that fascinating. We used to play croquet over there and have absolutely deadly games. I mean, people would get so mad, and I got furious and said, I'll never be on the same side as Paul, or the other side either. I won't be in a game with him, and so forth.
What was he like as a
Oh, he was terrible. He would cheat slightly and do all kinds of things. You know, he wrote any place. He also liked to disappear into the barn up there. And it had bats in it, and it's filthy. This is where he used to work.
I don't know at what point I began to read his work, but at a certain point I began to read not just his political work, but his book of stories, which I admired very much, his quite marvelous poems, many of which really are so thoughtful and so brilliant.
He was really bold and brave. Here was a man who was writing poems that dealt with homosexuality in such a frank way. It was shocking to me. I felt liberated by them. They were beautiful to me. They were strong poems. They were the poems of a man. The sonnets like God damn and blast, into a fist of dust reduce me, the contemptible I am. If I again hinder for guilt or shame, the blooming of my tenderness to lust like a red rose. I have my cock traduced, to which I should be loyal. None to blame but me myself, that I consort with them who dread to rouse me onward and distrust what has a future. Let me bawl hot tears for thee, my lonely and dishonored sex, in this fool world, where now for 40 years thou begg'st and And again thou beckst, because this is the only world there is. My rose in rags among these human wrecks. How do you deal with a poem like that?
One of my very first songs was the Lord the Hudson on Paul's poem of the same name. And he was very much on my mind as a lyricist. It's not because I was interested in the human voice that I was attracted towards song, but I was interested in poetry. Paul's poems work as songs for me because they are immediately understood, and what they say is universal. I don't know if he influenced me. I suppose he did. Not in social style particularly. He didn't suffer fools gladly, unless they were physically attractive. The poets, about 5 years younger than me, and Frank O'Hara would be the leading poet of that. When Frank died, within 2 or 3 years, he was one of the biggest influence on young American poets. And much of what Frank did, he got from Paul Goodman, which were writing poems on his cuff while he was in a bar drunk or in a Turkish bath or something, and not making them Ezra Poundish or T.S. Eliotish, but writing "My heart is breaking, I can't help it," or "I love you," or straightforward poems, or as Frank, or "I got up this morning and I baked a pie because Jennifer was coming this evening. I do this, I do that," kind of poems. And Paul started that business.
Be quiet, heart. Home. Home. I was coming home from Chicago when I wrote that.
Oh, I thought perhaps from some distant country.
Chicago's a very distant country for New York.
Nobody offered me to the Muses. I imposed on them. I had no father to rebel against, and I have lived by making trouble. I had no guidance. There were anyway no choices, but I staggered from need to need. Now I am like a father to these boys. What good can come of it? Why should they be loyal?
Percy and Paul came from a rather strange family. Their father had a love affair. Percy must have been about 6 or so, 7, and he never saw his father again. And Paul, of course, never saw his father. Paul's sister Alice was very much of a mother to him because his own mother was always working. So Alice, who was about 10 years older, was very helpful taking care of him.
It's certainly true that part of his story about himself, who he was and why he was like he was, had to do with his fatherlessness. But the truth is, he knew very little about his fatherlessness. He never saw a photo of his father. When he was growing up, no one spoke of his father. His father had left the family when Paul was being born. That family had been in comfortable circumstances, middle-class circumstances, and they were plunged into poverty by the father's leaving. So a kind of curtain was drawn across that past in the family. They didn't talk about the father. Every sign of the father was destroyed. So he grew up with the awareness a kid would have that this is not talked about. So that heightened the sense of fatherlessness. But he had a world, both a family world and also I mean, he loved the streets, and from 8 on, he was playing in the streets every day. He really wanted to be part of that gang of older kids, usually, and worked at it, and that was a key thing in all his life thereafter, so to be part of a street gang. And it counts for a lot of his romantic tastes the rest of his life, too. Both sides of it, that is, the family structure with the women at home and the domestic life you can count on, and playing in the streets.
Students join on a nationwide protest against war. Here are scenes at City College. Peaceful, what? Nothing like having a riot to work up that anti-war spirit.
One of Paul's friends, activist in the City College political scene of that day, 1930, said to him, "Paul, you talk just like an anarchist." So Paul immediately went to the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica and looked up anarchism, and there he found a wonderful essay by Peter Kropotkin, the quintessential communal anarchist, and read it, and then, sort of became an anarchist. The question is not so much why didn't Paul become a communist like so many of his City College peers, but why did they become communists? Good grief.
He had graduated from City College, magna cum laude, and no fellowship followed. Nobody said, "Come study more with me." And that was very bitter because he brought it up a lot. What he did do, though, which really impressed me, was he just walked up to Columbia, sat down in the graduate philosophy courses, and was allowed to take part. Now, this is the end of the Depression. The teachers were happy to have him, apparently, so he just sat, he audited, took the classes, and eventually took a class with Richard Peter McKeon, who was an amazing philosopher, who took him to Chicago on some kind of fellowship, and then he got his degree from Chicago.
Commentary magazine had its sort of new life starting in the 40s, and they were looking for people to write for them, and there was a whole stable of them. The New York Jews, who were also the New York intellectuals. They all wrote for commentary, and they invited Paul to write too, and he wrote a lot for commentary.
Did I know that I was in the world of the New York Jewish intellectual? I mean, later on, we would go to parties with Irving Howe and Daniel Bell, people who later became conservative. They'd all be there. And what the parties were nonstop talk about matters of extreme weight. And I thought it was fabulous. And I didn't know, I didn't have a perspective that all these guys had it's not really like weapons training, but they really had been to school to learn how to argue with one another.
And we'd talk about Kant, and we'd talk about Kennedy, and we'd talk about the Cold War, and we'd talk about the community of scholars. He was a personality. Paul was he was very lively.
He was hilariously funny to be with. I mean, when he was free of that, free of his loneliness, free of his typical complaints, Paul was just a very funny, witty, exciting person to be with.
Mainly, I remember laughing. Endless laughing, quick jokes, quick. It's almost like a written down of kind of routines that happened all the time. And that was just like a lot of fun and very interesting. So this continual interesting commentary on ideas, on people, on politics, continual kind of psychoanalysis of people. That was kind of nasty, but useful to me. A lot of people came to the house. And they were very interesting people, and I'd hear about Wittgenstein, and I'd hear about this painter, and I'd hear about the love life of that one. Endless, interesting, very involved talking, where every idea matters. Every idea you had mattered, crucially, it was life and death, and you went into it with a passion.
We were trying to define what is it we're looking for? What is the new art? What is the revolutionary art? What are the changes we really want to make? And that boiled up into an enthusiasm that caught on with the students and became the 60s. I think one of the things he liked about the Living Theater is that without money and with a lot of opposition, we persisted and put on beautiful and good plays, including his.
He used to say, he wrote this, anarchism, which is one word label he would give to what he represented, is not a set of principles, it's not a dogma, it's not a position, it's an attitude. You would hang around Paul, or you would read his books, never meet him, or both. And you were not learning your lessons. What we were doing is getting the habit of responding to experience in his company, from his point of view. So there might be a kind of family of responses and takes on life. You'll accept some of them, take some of them in, others not, they're not right for you. Paul changed my life, but the way he changed my life is, in a sense, knowing him gave me my life, and but it's mine.
If you look at something like the civil rights movement, you'll see that its entire progress and every success it has had, was in terms of decentralized, spontaneous uprising with considerable coordination, but almost no top-down direction. As soon as there was top-down direction, the thing would wither. The operative idea in participatory democracy is decentralizing, to multiply the number who are responsible, initiate, and decide.
Communitas is basically their idea of a communal, anarchist, or decentralized society that's tied to ways of life and means of livelihood, the subtitle of Communitas. Paul and his brother Percy, the architect, wrote together. It's a classic.
In Stony Point with John Cage and the Williamses, they have built their an idyll out of the theories of Paul Goodman and the Shakers and the anarchists.
I did love the book Communitas. I know I recommended it to many people. We did use a way of thinking that we had learned from Paul Goodman and with discussions with him, and also from Communitas. I'd say really a lot of thinking came from Goodman's kind of thinking about how the houses were placed. Many strands of my life, which had started quite far back before I ever met Paul Goodman, but were really brought into focus and developed by his thinking and writing.
I suppose a lot of people might remember the proposal to ban private traffic from Manhattan.
Only taxis and public transportation would be permitted. Percy and Paul were very close intellectually. They talked over a tremendous amount, and they felt one of the big problems in Manhattan was that there were too many cars, and that you had to be quite bold in order to cut back on the whole traffic problem.
And the drawings and the practicality of it, the big car parks at each of the bridges coming into Manhattan.
This would obviously make transportation much faster, it would cause less pollution, and it would solve a great many problems.
You'd get back 30% or 35% of the land in Manhattan, which could then be low-cost housing without being high-rise and community parks.
And they felt that we had some public transportation, we could have more, and there was no reason for people to bring a car into the city.
People thought, this is crazy, this is quirky, and other people looked at it and said, well, it makes such obvious, perfect sense, okay? Well, we're still talking, but it's maybe a little closer.
Just to consider, is this relevant? Again, we have the Friday, November 24th Times, bigger push for charging drivers who use the busiest streets. They've already implemented this in London. Remember, there's one line in banning cars where they say we could charge a fee to make it prohibitive. They're discussing congestion pricing, but they're not discussing it in as radical a way as Goodman was.
Goodman's way of thinking is the right way. Meaning that stuff that is made should not just be made only to solve a necessity. I mean, you should think of the ecological, you should think of how it benefits all mankind.
Like, he was so organized. He planned everything. When I read it, I was shocked because I drive, so I was like, oh, hell no.
To break away from what we're used to is scary. People are terrified of breaking away from the norm. Because we're so afraid of completely flipping the script, we just add on to what we already know.
Mr. Goodman is a stern and interesting critic of American educational axioms, and we are here to discuss whether public schools are necessary. If any of you believes that this is a shocking subject even to bring up, steel yourself for something worse. Mr. Goodman doesn't believe that literacy is even necessary. I'd like to ask why, Ms. Goodman?
Under urban or suburban conditions, normal kids, those who aren't emotionally blocked or culturally impoverished or so forth, would learn to read and write anyway because they're so exposed to the code. By age 9 or 10, if no effort whatever were made to teach them to read and write, just as they learn to speak with no effort being made to teach them to speak except to talk to them.
Then let's lead on from this axiom of yours that it is not worthwhile.
No, that's not an axiom.
To
that's
attempt.
a hypothesis.
Well, I'd volunteer it as a hypothesis. I'm usually more reverential towards what you write and treat it as axiomatic. Then let's pursue then your hypothesis.
In that time, Reed and Goodman criticizing the educational system and said, speaking in growing up absurd of the various kinds of absurdities it taught, was enormously freeing because it said, yes, it's okay to the feelings that are growing in your belly about the bad effect of this environment upon you. You're not nuts.
Mr. Goodman, what are you going to propose before the hearing today?
Well, fundamentally radical decentralization, not like the Bundy plan. I want to go down to tiny schools with about 25 with 4 teachers. I think I can show, and we've had experience of that you can run such schools at exactly the same cost as we now run schools with 28 or 30 kids and 1 teacher.
You mean classrooms, not schools?
No, a tiny school of 25 that would have 4 teachers and be 4 groups.
Isn't this a little unrealistic?
No, it's economically realistic in the sense I can show the figures would be the same. It's realistic staff-wise, and then I can show you have enough teachers. For instance, I'd use in each little school, I'd use a licensed teacher, a housewife, a college graduate who has taken no education courses, and a teenager who's literate and who's probably graduated from high school. That's quite sufficient, and that staffing is very easy to get and quite cheap, except for the licensed teacher. But it's realistic economically, it's realistic pedagogically, it's unrealistic politically, because the teachers' union won't stand for it and the Board of Education won't stand for it. But then they are wrong.
Well,
it's actually really useful to think in a utopian way with a practical veneer, so the practicality is pedagogical, and that Goodman could make you think about all those things, and that they're not inevitable, that they are human choices of what to do with the technology, and they could be made differently.
And sometimes this was a sly pretense of being a moderate. He's not asking for a lot, even when he was asking for a very lot, as in his utopian essays and practical proposals, which were often highly impractical, but slyly claiming to a kind of plausibility, a sly plausibility. Yes, of course you can have universities without administrations, only you can't do it tomorrow, but yeah, sure, you can imagine that.
The essence of an honest scholar is to point out to people what could be done, how it could be done, why that conception is the most direct and probably the only one which really works in the end, and then hope that you educate the public. Just what the professional has to do is to elevate the public to sense.
I think my father's from a different intellectual tradition. It's the old tradition of the man of letters, a much broader, wider tradition. You're supposed to know the scientific culture, literary and philosophical and theological culture. You're supposed to know it all if you were a proper grown-up.
I'm a Jeffersonian. And Jefferson felt, with Aristotle, by the way, that the chief function of a political society is to educate its young. That's what it's about. And we ought to be spending much more money on it than we do.
To make them liberating.
That's right. And if, as you remember, Jefferson felt that a very important part of that was that they should learn history, because by studying history, they could learn how to be vigilant for freedom. That's what he thought when cut out of history. And that would, of course, require literacy. But that would, of course, also require reading as an art. That is, where you're reading not to know a code, but for truth and imagination, and so forth.
But in order to read that way, you've got to learn how to read for instrumental purposes.
That's where I think you're wrong, if you think that. That's exactly what's wrong with our teaching reading
or
at present.
axiomatically?
That's what's wrong with our teaching at present. We take reading, instead of being an art, as if we're the learning of a tool subject. But this isn't at all how a person learns, because the person learns by an intrinsic need or reaching out. And what you reach out to is what's interesting. And if the text isn't interesting, then why bother? For instance, if I teach elementary Latin, and I have done this, I have, unfortunately, in my career, had to teach elementary Latin, I at once wrote them a little manual which was pornographic. Because every kid of 11 wants to read that.
Well, aren't you simply suggesting a revision of teaching procedures? But why do you go on to make the inference that the entire public school system ought to be abolished?
Because if we have a system which is run centrally, where we have 1 million children, let's say in New York City, and 50,000 teachers, and 1 million children, it will always be run as social engineering.
Well, there's plenty of pornography in New York City.
Not in the school system, unfortunately. I wish there were more.
People were putting garlands around his head and so on because he was really smart and because he had an unusual quality of mind and so on. And then he would go and do something outrageous, in the sexual department. The classic story is, of course, making out right outside the dean's window at the University of Chicago. I actually don't know under what circumstances he left. I don't know whether he was fired from his job or whatever, but he did get fired from his jobs.
Paul apparently made passes at both the soldier and his wife. And now I do not know which pass the soldier took umbrage to, but the next thing we knew, he'd gotten quite a beating. We got an SOS that things had gone terribly wrong there and that Paul had had his glasses broken.
That kind of openness was a help to me, I suppose, because he wasn't open in any political or blatant way. He just would say he instead of she. He was not handsome by any, and he always wore his glasses and so forth, and he didn't work out. His vice when he went into a bar was not drinking too much, but making passes to people who weren't interested. And he tried to seduce people through intellect rather than, but when he went to bars on 42nd Street, I don't know how many sailors are impressed with talking about Proust. And he made passes at literally everybody, everybody. Men and women and people's mothers and the president of the university and so forth, and didn't see what was wrong with it. So he was no fun to cruise with, as we all said in those days.
I think what's interesting is what his daily life was. He was living at home always, as he didn't go to work. There were short periods in his life when he taught, but for the most part, he was a writer living at home. He wrote in the mornings. He wrote very fast. He was facile. If you look at the manuscripts, there's not much correction, there are not many second drafts. He could write it right off. He got better and better at that, too. And he produced an enormous amount just by writing in the morning. Then he would go in the afternoons, wandering the streets, sit in a bar maybe. This was a cruising time. You know, he was always, as he put it, looking for love where it cannot be found. Love, you know, meant momentary infatuation, promiscuous, and here today, gone tomorrow. Maybe he'd meet a friend. Maybe he'd just wander, sometimes along the Hudson, along the rocks. Just padding around.
All I could think of was he was a big dope to go cruising on the piers. I mean, God, didn't he know what he could catch? You know, things like that. And what was he so goddamn proud of, his prick, you know? But everybody has one except women.
He used to pride himself, I think this is a little comic, on always being home for dinner. You know, I mean, big deal. Who was cooking? That's a real question. And of course, Sally was always home for dinner, cooking.
He's drunk again and doesn't show. My wife is home, he can't come here. Yesterday, the bus was slow. Or let's suppose the coast is clear. Deep in slumber lies my dear. We have our moments even so, and fuck and fondle front and rear. But happiness is touch and go. Even though neither one says no, to get both bodies to appear has been a science I don't know. Though I a yellow hood can wear and slashes blue and sleeves that flare, yet times we kiss and times we blow, and other times we just sit near. But happiness is touch and go. He's off to work, money's low, my wife is lonely, I love her. He keeps on terms with Tom and Joe. At dinner, I'm in Daddy's chair. How can you be both here and there? Nevertheless, we whisper slow, sweet talk in each other's ear. But happiness is touch and go. Mercury, bring the distant near. Apollo, make the sun go slow. Linger longer, fleeting year. Happiness is touch and go.
I didn't feel left out of, I mean, I certainly didn't want to be part of his wandering around picking up guys in bars. It just was another thing about him that was different, but there were plenty of things about him that were different. He never bothered about how he dressed or how he talked and or who he antagonized or things of that sort. So. And he was Jewish, and that was a total mystery to me. I'd never known anybody Jewish either. I was fascinated, you know, by his intellect, I guess, and I just liked him from the moment we met.
Did he encourage you to, did he encourage you to have affairs?
Absolutely not. Can become furious if I did.
Did you, was that ever an
well,
issue?
Occasionally it was an issue, not very often.
How did you feel about that?
Mad.
Yeah.
After we went to Harold Norse's, Harold also invited the Goodmans. But they refused on the grounds that they were enjoying connubial bliss. Guess whom I'm madly in love with? Sally of all people. My God, it's wonderful, quotes Harold of Paul. Everyone is pleased, as though some family black sheep had settled down to the satisfaction of aunts and uncles.
Paul never picked up anybody that he didn't give his best soul and attention and intellect to. he was a teacher to everyone. I'm sure, I don't know about his casual pickups, but I'm sure that every one of them profited by encountering a man of such depth, and that he gave every one of them, even if it was a quick blow job, that he gave him his best heart and his best ideas.
This was written just recently, and it's called A Plane to Pittsburgh.
The ills of this world are mathematical, as Kafka said. I noticed 3 fellows boarding the plane that I'd like to sit next to me. But the 96 seats are assigned at random, and even discounting the pairs who sit together, the odds against my happiness are overwhelming. So it proves. Oh, I keep at it, disturbing my obnoxious seatmate. I get up and walk the aisles and ask for a match. I beat my brain for a pretext to exchange seats, but nothing is plausible. Anyway, the weather is rough and the pilot keeps flashing fasten seat belts. So I give up and write these sentences to pass the time, to make do. The evils of this world are mathematical. They are mathematical. The goods I have found don't fall into my lap. Some people have a lot of luck. Others, worse off than I, don't have a chance to even make an effort. The blonde with the squinty eyes was best, though not the best looking. Blue-collar class. There's quicker savvy in a boy like that, for a short flight. And there's Pittsburgh. Yes, and another thing, the lower-class boy would have had less prejudice against how old I am. He would have fewer notions. Kafka himself was in the actuarial business. He would know.
One of my lasting memories of Paul is the first time I met Paul. Paul came back from Europe, and we were to pick him up. And Matthew was really excited, you know, in a way that showed how much he loved his father. And we tried to prepare things in the house and stuff. We got to this airport, and Paul walked off the plane with this beautiful young boy, and was not interested in us or anything at all. And it was devastating to me. I was furious. Matthew was much more accepting, like, this is the way my father is. I was angry. Matthew became very quiet. So that's an impression of Paul, unfortunately, that has stayed with me for, you know, since 1966, a long time.
And he certainly was very driven by his sexuality, but I think that that was always a source of interest, excitement, of approach to the world. He was always fed by that. And his refusal to deny that, I think, is directly related to the unending flow of speech and words that he had when he was alone and when he was with others. The fact about Paul is that he was a married man with children. They were really married. And I don't think that for all the trouble that there was between them, he never was prepared to leave that relationship. And I actually think he couldn't imagine life without that relationship. I mean, I think it was bedrock, core relationship.
Before, somewhere in the late 40s, Paul was the happiest person with the most pleased smile on his face, filled with all that juice of life. It's almost a smirk sometimes, like, man, this is life, you know. A set of things happened to him in the 40s that made it all kind of crumble. There was domestic unhappiness with his first wife. There was the war. He was a pacifist who was developing his pacifism. This mass murder that the war was got him in a lot of trouble because, you know, he made seditious statements in print. He had enemies who were partly his enemies over that issue. Partly there were people who hated him as a homosexual. I mean, bisexual was what he actually was. So he ended up being, in the early 40s, blackballed in many of the journals and other places where he could publish. But that was also mixed with the fact that his writing was avant-garde in a way that was not going to be popular. He also felt, hey, I can't get published. Now, in fact, he was getting published. He'd published already 11 books. On the other hand, what he couldn't get is an audience. On his birthday, actually, in 1951, he wrote a little essay on being a writer. Never published it, which basically said, I give up. That was the point at which Gestalt Therapy came out, the book he had collaborated with Fritz Perls and Ralph Hefferlein on, that became the founding text of the Gestalt Therapy movement.
This is Perls, if you... Now, what some people have asked is, how did it be that these two guys got together? We don't know that they really liked each other that much. They were so different, but something clicked. Something clicked. There was some kind of synergy there.
Paul practiced as a therapist for 10 years. He decided that he was always talking to people about their problems anyway. So why not open shop, you know? And so he did.
I've begun psychoanalytic sessions with Paul Goodman. I've been seeing him 3 times a week for a little over a month.
The basic technique is this: not to explain things to the patient, but to provide the patient with opportunities to understand and to discover himself. For this purpose, I manipulate and frustrate the patient in such a way that he's confronting himself. We are going to have an interview for half an hour.
Right away, I'm scared.
You say you're scared, but you're smiling. I don't understand how one can be scared and smile at the same time.
And I'm also suspicious of you. I think you understand very well. I think you know that when I get scared, I laugh or I kid to cover up.
Are you aware of your smile? You don't believe a word what I say.
I do too, but I know you're going to pick on me for it.
Sure, you're bluff, you're phony.
Do you believe, you're meaning that seriously?
Yeah. If you say you're afraid and you laugh and you giggle and you squirm, it's phony. You put in a performance for me.
Oh, I resent that very much.
Can you express it?
Yes, sir. Boy, I resent you calling me a phony. Just because I smile when I'm embarrassed or I'm put in a corner doesn't mean I'm being a phony.
Wonderful, thank you. You didn't smile for the last minute.
Well, I'm mad at you.
That's right. You didn't have to cover up your anger with your smile.
And besides that, it's like passing judgment when you call me phony. I just hate that anyway.
Now we're getting somewhere.
Paul spends entire sessions insulting me. Why does he do this? Occasionally I get angry, but I've gotten used to it so that I often merely observe it. You are not qualified to discuss this, he says of precisely those things I know best. Paul won't see this as his problem and insists on playing the Zen teacher.
The way Gestalt therapy works, you are not just the boss of the therapy, but you are in the therapy. The whole 10 years was self-treatment, was his lesson in making contact with others who needed him, who he could do something for.
Another thing that's wonderful about the work that he did for Gestalt psychology was to advance that notion of the boundary as something that is flexible, that dissolves, that comes back into place. He was there for me, and I think for members of my generation, to violate boundaries. And that was, you know, between the life of the avant-garde artist and the university professor. There's the family man, there's the gay man. He just knocked those boundaries down. At least he changed the material from being a wood to something permeable.
Gestalt therapy was not his calling, but it was his way of finding a new calling. The public role he would ultimately take was not as an artist, although he thought of himself primarily as an artist, but rather as a public intellectual and the philosopher of the New Left, the man who set the agenda, who had the ideas, who taught the attitude that really taught everyone in the 60s.
I'd like to start the press conference now by introducing Mr. Paul Goodman.
It was a 20 million mandate not to do precisely what he did. Now, I don't know whether he was lying or whether he's simply a captive. But in any case, the president received a 20 million vote mandate precisely not to go to Vietnam or to escalate that war in Vietnam. That's what that election was about. It was about the nuclear threat and about the Vietnam War. Under these conditions, our problem is how to restore substantive democracy in the country rather than formal democracy.
You know, it spread out from him. People didn't know where it was coming from. Those ideas are still in our world.
If it comes out that after we've tested the general will as hard as we can, that the Americans simply have become so callous and brainwashed that they don't care whether they fight things like the Vietnam War, then I have to feel that I'm a man without a country.
When Paul Goodman wrote Growing Up Absurd in 1959, he electrified the public with his description of the shattering impact on the young generation of the spiritual emptiness of contemporary society. Now, 8 years later, it is not spiritual emptiness that is terrifying, but spiritual evil. In 1967, young men of America are fighting, dying and killing in Asian jungles in a war whose purposes are so ambiguous the whole nation sees with dissent.
We decided to have a mass draft card burning. It was the largest draft card burning in the history of the country. Matthew held up the sign, 20 years unregistered, and I smoked my draft card.
Matthew was a very principled person. He never registered for the draft because he felt like that was the proper thing to do. If you didn't believe in war, you shouldn't register for the draft. He was up there burning draft cards, but he didn't have one to burn.
He had soft features, but he was very, very determined. But he was extremely determined, extremely bright. He had a difficult relationship with Paul, he said. There was a lot of fighting, but a tremendous amount of respect that he had for Paul. And I knew even then that Paul had it for him.
Goodman republished his May pamphlet, originally written in 1945. The new title was Drawing the Line.
I can remember very well how those words really first struck me. There is no right or wrong place to draw the line, but he says no particular drawn line will ever be defensive logically, but by the right way from any line will prove itself more clearly step by step and blow by blow. I had drawn the line at registering for the draft, and I hadn't registered for the draft. The second time I went to prison, I was arrested at a demonstration at a helicopter factory outside Philadelphia. There was an intention to try to climb on these helicopters to stop them from being shipped off to Vietnam. He didn't say that there was any particular place to draw the line, but that drawing it was very important, and that usually you ended up having to do it quite a bit.
Mr. Goodman, now you are also open to prosecution. How do you feel about it?
When the young come to me, maybe twice a week, some young fellow will be in my house asking what he should do about the draft. When they were planning the April 15th draft card burning, they came to my house asking if I would help them. Now, what am I supposed to do except tell them what I think the facts are, what I think a noble, moral, just, honorable action would be? If then, of their own steam, they perform that action, I must support them. I must give them money. I have given them money. I'll put them up. I'll feed them. And I'll advise them the best I can. You see, we don't have any alternative.
The Greenwich Village Peace Center was a nonviolent organization. Almost all of us were half socialist, half anarchist, half this, half that. We had been established by the Quakers. The Friends Service Committee established community peace centers. So that's how we would get to be involved with Paul, with the whole idea of community. We did draft counseling, and we took a very strong stand.
Both my father and my brother were sort of in the crosshairs of FBI surveillance, my brother being a draft resistor, and my father promoting draft resistance during the Vietnam War. When the doorbell rang and we weren't expecting something, I remember thinking to myself, I hope it's not the FBI here to take away either my father or my brother. So we certainly grew up with that hanging over us.
See, I'm a pacifist entirely. I'm not a moral pacifist, entirely on grounds of reason. This kind of way of being in the world, of piling up armaments, is simply what a prudent man, a rational man, cannot possibly do. I cannot, as a living being and a father, acquiesce in the notion that my children, I mean, I'm not so young anymore, but, you know, they're beginning. You know, my boy's 16, just going off to college. My girl's 23. I have a little baby. I really cannot acquiesce in the fact that these kids are going to be wiped off the face of the earth. I just cannot acquiesce in that. And therefore, the notion nothing can be done is completely unsatisfactory to me. Something must be done.
And then when he got accepted, you know, you couldn't go into a dentist's office without picking up the magazine and finding an article by Paul Goodman in it, you know, every day for 10 years. But it was a different world when he was accepted. It took away his identity, which he had worked hard building for all those years, of somebody who was on the outside, on the fringes. Nobody listens to me, whine, whine, whine.
I think it must have been very hard for him to want to live truthfully and then decide what the truth was, which meant that he could hardly live with anybody. It's really tough.
I want to ask you, at the age of 58, whether you, as a so-called elder statesman of the youth movement, can still communicate
Well, I certainly can't communicate at all with what are probably the most important group, what we would call in this country the junior high school kids.
13 and 14 years old?
Yeah, they obviously, I don't dig them at all, and they don't talk to me. And anyway, I don't speak their language, and I find their music boring, so there's very little way to get on with them. I still can communicate with the collegians, although the militants now hate my guts, and they, you know, they lie in wait for me to come and shoot shafts at me. But that's their mistake, because I'm pretty good at handling shafts. And the result is that the great majority of the students suddenly take heart. Here's somebody who makes sense, unlike SDS, for instance, which makes none.
When you're talking about yourself.
That's right.
And like the thing that I read from your writing is that you're very alienated. I mean, you regard youth as being very threatening. And, you know, you're very traditionalist, and you're very confused.
The confused, I hope. Threatening, no. Disappointing, yes. See, I have to explain
but
that.
No, see, you're not
I have to
disappointed.
explain that. Look, I've been an awful dissatisfied with American life for a good many years, you know. I've been at this game for a long, long time of being on the outs in American society, you know. I'm an anarchist from way, way back, and I resisted the war, and I've been a pacifist, and, you know, fought them tooth and nail, et cetera, et cetera. Along around the end of the 50s, the beginning of the 60s, it struck me that suddenly I was getting a lot of allies, and a lot of young people, for instance, the free speech movement in Berkeley, was making terrific sense, and thank God we're suddenly getting some living sense in American society which might make a change, see. But then, unfortunately, as the decade wore on, I became real disappointed. Now, this isn't their fault. It's not up to them to please me, but I'm just telling you how it is. I became real disappointed that they were losing the moral integrity, the keen insight, the political, you know, concreteness, etc., which I saw in 1962 and 63.
It was, I think, unfortunate time in that anyone who raised critical issues was not going to be heard because of the degree of polarization. And if you were an older white guy, I mean, you had even less chance of being heard.
Everything was changing. If we'd had more intellectual time, if there hadn't been the Vietnam War, there might have been more of a revolutionary change in some funny way than the revolutionary change that came because of the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War allowed people to become stupid.
Ultimately, Paul ended up feeling that the youth movement had just taken all the wrong turns. He didn't give up on them completely, but you know, he was heckled at his speeches after a while.
The kids had made a mess. They had what looked like a great opportunity, and they ruined it. He was dismayed by it. He had wonderful expectations, as you can see from Growing Up Absurd, in human nature. And he also had a very keen idea of his limits. All at the same time, it takes a genius to bring those two together in one body. But that's what he was. That's why he was interesting.
He didn't like the drugs, and he thought that they were just not serious in their joy. He wanted people to be crazy on their own, you know. He believed that it was in all of us to be able to be like that.
They didn't get him as a traditionalist. They didn't get him as part of a rich literary tradition because he was queer for young guys. Maybe that was involved too. And maybe it was. But they didn't realize that he was a wonderful writer, a fabulous poet, short story writer, interesting novelist, author of a great book called Empire City, writer in City Plan, therapist of the Living Theater, playwright. Mainly they thought of him as a pop sociologist and public speaker.
Our children lived out some of their parents' ideas. Matthew was totally opposed to war and violence in every way.
This was Paul's only son, and of course the fact that it was his son was of incredible importance. And he was so proud of Matthew, and he always wrote about Maddie.
North Percy. Playing too happily on the slippery mountainside, my only son fell down and died. I taught him to talk honestly and without stalling come across, but I could not teach him the cowardice and ambiguity to live a longer life unhappily. You see, girl, you ought not to center your affections so little short of idolatry. A young man is untrustworthy. In the morning, satisfied, he gets up from your bed, and in the evening, he is dead.
There was a rock covered with moss that Matthew used to slide down. and I think it was wet, and he lost his balance, and he tumbled over.
I don't remember a lot about my father's relationship with Matthew, and I think that's because there may not have been as intimate a relationship between Matthew and Paul as there was between Matthew and Sally. They were very close, and I think Paul and Matthew had some distance between them. However, when he died, my father was devastated, absolutely devastated, and I do believe that's what contributed to his first heart attack, was his grief.
I think he went very quickly downhill after that. He more or less stopped writing, maybe some poetry, but he didn't do much else. And more or less disappeared from my life. I think he became reclusive. It was a terrible, terrible blow to him. He loved that boy.
He had lost sort of his connection with the younger generation of males.
It was the loss of the new hope.
His Gestalt therapy groups were a community in the Living Theater, especially when they were putting on his plays, were community. You know, he had a lot of little communities. But it was not satisfying, ultimately, to him. It didn't fill the bill somehow, so that he kept still feeling like he was an outsider somehow. And then there were occasions when he, like, got fired, or couldn't keep the job, or they didn't want him. Those sometimes he spoke of as no community would have him.
He just had very little ability to be comfortable as the human being he was. I mean, he spent a lot of time trying to make the world around him simpatico to the kind of human being he was as a gay man, and a gay man with a family, and as an intellectual and educator and so forth. But I think no matter how much he had changed it, he wouldn't have been comfortable in it anyway. I think that was probably one of his big limitations.
Sometimes I said I was marooned, sometimes that I was imprisoned, or was in exile from my land, or I was born on the wrong planet. But my daily fact, Lord, is that awake I am a coward, and in my dreams that say the cause, I have lost the address. I'm confused.
All those years of work, trial, suffering, success, so on, when he also always thought that all of his work was perfect, that, you know, he never wrote a bad line, he was a great writer. He really believed that, you know? And that was good for him because he just kept writing, you know? And finally he got actually as good as he thought he was. So by the end, he couldn't write a bad line. You know, it's amazing the things he wrote first draft at the end of his life. Such prose with such complicated ideas, so simply, lucidly stated, so moving. Oh.
Here's a poem for today, a poem by Paul Goodman, entitled, I Planned to Have a Border of Lavender. I planned to have a border of lavender, but planted the bank, too, of lavender, and now my whole crazy garden is grown in lavender. It smells so sharp, heady, and musky of lavender, and the hue of only lavender is all my garden up into the gray rocks. When forth I go from here, the heedless lust I squander, and in vain, for I am stupid and miss the moment it has blessed me silly when forth I go. And when, sitting as gray as these gray rocks among the lavender, I breathe the lavender's tireless squandering, I liken it to my silly lusting. I liken my silly, indefatigable lusting to the lavender, which has grown over all my garden, banks and borders up into the gray rocks.
Paul Goodman is dead. Last night at his farm in New Hampshire, Goodman, after suffering his third heart attack, died at the age of 60. Goodman thought all his work of a single piece. I am a humanist, he once said, and everything I do has exactly the same subject, the organism and the environment. Anything I write is pragmatic. It aims to accomplish something.
I felt an affection for him, which bordered on love, I guess as much as you can for someone that you've never met and never heard, who frankly never knew you existed. I'd read that there was going to be a memorial service, and to be sitting there with his family and people who also had known him intimately, who were men, it was a very moving experience and reinforced for me that I'd made the right decision. I was in a city where these things were possible, where a life like this could be led. A man whose work has that much resonance for one life, I can't help thinking so many people would benefit by knowing more about his work. If it just could come back. It needs to be here. We need to have it again around us.